And we've just sung Psalm 23, I will trust in you alone. We've said that faith in the Bible has to do with more with trust rather than hope against hope. And we've just sung it, I will trust in you alone. And even though we go through the valley of death, we go into dark paths. As we go into the dark paths, we're going to trust in God alone. And in this lecture, the second lecture, we're going to descend into some of the dark paths and look at what's there. And we do this for a reason. It's really important that we are prepared to face the truth about life, face the reality of the struggle that we face this side of heaven. We need to be able to, at least mentally, if not experientially, go through the valley and take a look at what's there if we're to come to terms with the solution to that and where we need to go as we move beyond it. So in this second lecture, we're going to look at the question, does God care? Does he care? In light of the reality that we face in the world. We want to think about pain. We want to think about struggle. We want to think about the agony and the misery of life, why it's there, and how we can begin to deal with it. Now I want to start, as we look at this subject, by saying that there is a philosophical problem. This problem has been debated by philosophers down through the centuries, and it's often thrown up as a real challenge to Christian faith. Maybe you have encountered this problem in this challenge in some way, shape or form. It is called the problem of pain. The problem of pain. And actually C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. So if you want to know more about the subject, you can read his book. It's a good book. And I went back to that book briefly to try to get his definition of the problem of pain. And the way Lewis describes it, he describes it this way. He actually goes back to a medieval theologian by the name of Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas was talking about this matter. So again, you can see that this is an age-old issue and problem. And the way Aquinas puts it as he's discussing this argument is this way. He says, in its simplest form, we can say this: if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. We are not happy. Therefore, God either lacks goodness or power or both, or he's not there at all. He doesn't exist. So this, in a nutshell, there are various versions of this, but this in a nutshell is the problem of pain. Let me go over it again. If God were all good, if he were a benevolent God, he would want to wish good things for his creatures. He'd want us to experience a good life. If God were all powerful, then he'd be able to realize that goal. He'd be able to fulfill his wishes. But we are not happy. We are not comfortable. So either God is not all good, or he's not all powerful, things catch him by surprise, and he's powerless, or he doesn't exist at all. So that's the problem of pain. And it's a challenge that's come to many a Christian in terms of debates or interacting with people. How can you say you believe in God when all of the bad things that happen in life? How can you say you believe in God? So I've just intellectually convinced you to abandon your faith, right? Well, maybe not so soon, but it is a challenge. And if you look on YouTube, you will find that there are many Christian apologists who have wrestled with this issue and come up with a whole lot of arguments to respond to it. Christian apologists are people who are not apologising. Apologia is the Greek word for defence. So Christian apologists are people who defend the faith. They stand up in the fray, in Mars Hill as it were. They enter into the debate and they say, look, you've said this is an inescapable problem, but I've got an answer to it. And so on YouTube there are many good lectures on the subject. You can just search for it and you will find a lot of good material. And I don't intend to sort of summarise all of that for you. You can do your own research if you're interested in some good answers to this as you're debating perhaps or engaging with non-Christians, people who don't believe. What we're going to do instead is to look at some of what the Bible teaches on the subject of pain and suffering. We're going to look at pain and suffering as taught in the Bible and something of the Bible's response to it. And I want to discuss what bearing this has on the hope that we can have as Christians. So we're going to relate it to our subject. So the first part of this lecture really, after introducing the problem of pain, is the reality of pain and suffering. The reality of pain and suffering. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. First thing I want to say as you're turning to this is one thing the Bible does not do is play down or minimise the issue of pain and suffering in the world. The Bible does not say, she'll be right, mate. The Bible does not say, there's always a silver lining to every cloud. The Bible is not eternally optimistic about this, in the sense of, we're always looking on the bright side. No. The Bible faces this subject fair and square, and it hits it right between the eyes so as to leave us in no doubt that you and I are going to experience pain and suffering in this life prior to freedom from it in heaven. So let's look at Genesis 6, 5 to 9. This is the story of the flood, and so it's God's judgment that comes upon the world back there in history. And we read in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this an absolutely staggering statement. It's a staggering statement. We can learn a great deal from these two verses. God is looking at the earth. Remember in Genesis chapter 1, God saw all that he had made. We'll come back to this later on. He sees all that he has made and he declares it as good. Well, now God is looking again, and he's looking at all of these human beings that he's made, people who bear his image. And his judgment is very different. We can learn many things from this. Number one, human beings are wicked. Sorry to say it, but it's just what the Bible says, There is a natural degree of wickedness that's in all of our hearts that's just wanting to come out and express itself in various actions. At this time in history, God looks at all of humanity and he says, look, they are wicked. Every last one of them. Number two, this wickedness is great and it's universal. This was severe and it's universal. And there needs to be a universal judgment and response. Number three, the heart, the lave that we talked about last time, of human beings is corrupt. And remember, this word heart in the Hebrew Bible is not just the organ that pumps the blood around the body, it also involves the mind. So here's an evidence of that definition by Yoram Hazoni is accurate. Every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So it's not just how people are feeling back then. and they're getting carried away with their emotions and they're doing bad things that they regret. No, it's what they're thinking. The imagination of the heart is only evil continually. So emotions and thoughts are affected. Fourth thing we can learn is that evil deeds stem from evil hearts. Jesus makes this point: the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. So his disciples at that time were eating grain, and the Pharisees were saying, oh, that's not right, because, they haven't washed their hands, they haven't gone through ceremonial cleansing, so they're going to become unclean if they eat this grain without going through the ceremonial cleansing. And Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach. He says, look, what goes into the mouth and into the stomach, that's not what causes uncleanness. Actually, what causes uncleanness is what comes out of the heart, which involves the speech as well as the feelings, right? It's cerebral as well as it is emotional. And we're all born like this. It's just the way it is. So, there's this idealistic set of parents, and they're having their first child, and it's wonderful. This first child, we're going to raise him the right way, He's going to be fantastic. He's going to be a model child. So, we don't have to sit down. We're not going to sit down and say, Johnny, here's how you lie. You do this. Something is true, and you say the opposite. Repeat after me. I am going. You don't have to teach your children to lie. You're going to do it. He's up doing it naturally, because it comes out of his heart, you see, the heart that he's born with. This is just the Bible's declaration about human nature. And every parent knows it. We all know it, don't we? The next thing we learn is that God was sorry that he had made man, his own image bearers. The Bible says that God was sorry. He regretted this. The Bible also says that in God's lave, in God's heart, there was great pain. So, is God somehow separate and above everything that's happening in the world, and he's sort of up there in the ivory towers of his throne, looking around and, unengaged? No. God is looking at what's going on in the world. He's looking at all of this evil, this wickedness, this mess that humanity has got the world into, and he is grieving in his heart. The Bible says, grieve not the Holy Spirit. This is something that affects God right at the very level of his existence. Staggering statement. Now, you might like to think that this is pre-flood, so okay, the situation was really bad. It was universally bad, everybody wicked. God grieved that the situation had come about. But he's going to start again. And he's going to wipe all this away, put it all to the side. And he'll start again with Noah and his family. Noah's a righteous man, right? Noah's a righteous man. And he's got his family, and all will be well. But let's turn over to Genesis chapter 8. So the flood has now occurred, and God's starting afresh with a new head of humanity, Noah. And we read in verse 20, Noah built an altar to the Lord and said, taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, again in his lave, never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. So God has started afresh, and he says, never again will I curse the ground in the way that I've done. Never again will there be this universal judgment in the way that's just occurred. Seed time and harvest are going to continue and all of that. Even though the situation is unchanged. Even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And we see it in Noah. Noah, a righteous man, but Noah gets drunk. We see it in his sons, particularly Canaan, who wanted to make a big deal of this. The other brothers were trying to cover over their father's nakedness. But sin is there at the level of the heart post-flood. Now, the interesting thing is that God's promise here that, things are going to continue and there's not going to be this devastation, this decreation that had occurred during the time of the flood. Things are going to continue. That promise comes on the basis of a sacrifice. A sacrifice. God smells the soothing aroma of the animal sacrifice that Noah makes, and on the basis of that sacrifice, things are going to be allowed to continue. And God puts his bow up into the cloud as a sign of these promises that he's never going to destroy all of the world by means of a deluge like this. And that's a very interesting sort of sign of security that God has given all the world in that rainbow. You see, one of the things about rainbows is they occur everywhere, all parts of the earth, right? And they are beautiful. When you see one, look at that, glorious. All those colours. This is the bow. And in the Hebrew, the word is war bow. I'm going to put my bow in the clouds, and there it is. Thing about the rainbow is also it can only occur when there is water droplets in the air, right? And when the sun is shining through. So it's as the sun shines through those water droplets that you get all these glorious colours. God's war bow. So you don't get rainbows without sun and rain. So every time we see a rainbow, we need to think, well, there was a judgment. And there was a time when the rain fell so heavily for so long, they didn't see any sun because God wiped the slate clean. But now, I'm seeing the sun shine through. I'm seeing hope. I'm seeing some promises of God. I'm seeing things getting better and improving. And this is God's universal sign for all the world in his declaration after the flood. And it comes on the basis of the sacrifice, which of course is a message that runs right throughout Scripture and zeroes in on the sacrifice of Christ. This is the only way that God can deal with, or does deal with, the problem of human pain and suffering ultimately. So, when it comes to the reality of pain as it's expressed in the Bible, there's no minimization. We can speak of betrayal, the breakdown of relationships and family, the stories we read about in the Bible. Some of them are horrific. Brutality, all forms of abuse, needless killing, plagues, disasters, the works. Read the book of Genesis, you will see. Read the book of Judges. Some people think bits of it need to be X-rated. Read the books of Kings and Chronicles. You will see in living, lurid detail the misery and the pain and the struggle and the suffering of human life. The Bible does not gild the lily, not in any way, shape or form. So that's the reality. What's the source of it all? Well, we've been in Genesis 8 and 9. We're going to go back now to Genesis chapter 3. You are very familiar with this passage, doubtless. But we're going to cover this ground anyway, because it's very important as we're dealing with the problem of pain that we understand the solution, the reason for all of this. So, at the end of Genesis chapter 2, we read that God has created this beautiful world. He's created this garden with these 2 trees in it, plus all the other fruit. And He's created His image bearers, Adam and Eve. He's created Adam in a very personal way, Genesis chapter 2, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. He's created Eve as Adam's helper, and He's given them this wonderful environment, and He said, here, go to it. There's only one tree that I want you to stay away from. I want you to not eat its fruit, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis chapter 2 verse 17. You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. All the other trees you may eat, including, I think we can assume, the tree of life. You can eat of that. It's not forbidden. It's there in the garden. It's good. I just want you to stay away from this particular tree, and it's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Stay away from that, because in the day that you eat from that, you're going to die. Everything else, enjoy. Then we get to Genesis chapter 3 and the temptation. So the serpent comes to Eve and Adam. The serpent is saying, verse 4, you surely won't die if you eat that fruit. You're not going to die. No. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So this tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God has said, stay away from it, because you're going to die. Serpent says, you won't die. God knows. He's really envious of his own position. He wants to maintain his own superiority. He knows that if you eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God. And God doesn't want you to be like him. Now that was a lie, isn't it? It's a lie because Adam and Eve were already like God. Of all of God's creatures, Adam and Eve were made in the image and likeness of God. And they were to be his representatives in all the world. They were to go out there and husband all of the world's wonderful resources and look after the animal world and do all those wonderful things, serving in the name of God, repeating God's words, thoughts after him, representing him in the world. They were already like God. But there was one way in which they weren't. And that one way was knowing or determining what is good and what is evil. You see, God had this particular position in which he said, he could say, this is good, that is evil. I determine this. I know it, I say it. And Adam and Eve, as God's image bearers, were to say, well, Lord, if you say that this is good and that's evil, I'll accept that and I will say this is good and I will carry on that as evil. I'll stay away from it. Serpent is saying, you need to change that. You actually need to be in God's position of determining for yourself what you will do and not do, what's good and evil. So then we get, in the very next verse, the language of determination. Look at it, verse 6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it, and she also gave to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. When the woman saw, and the language here is an echo of the language that we have read in Genesis chapter 1. The end of Genesis chapter 1, after God had made all of this beautiful world, we read that God saw all that he had made and that it was very good. So that's the language of, oh, it's not surprise, it's a case of I determine, I see, I declare all that I have made is very good. Including, by the way, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God had made that, and that too was good because it was there for a purpose. There was a use for that. So that was good too. But now Eve is looking at this fruit that's forbidden by God, and she's looking at this as she's determining, actually this is going to complete me as a person. This is going to fulfill me. This is going to give me knowledge and insight which I don't have. This is going to give me the judgment that I'm yearning for. I can actually be a God in my own right. So she's not interested in an afternoon snack here. She's interested in God's position. Her husband too. They want God's position. They wanted to be able to decide for themselves good and evil, right and wrong, truth and error, independent of God and apart from him. So the fall occurs. They say, God, we don't need you. We'll do it our way, as the saying goes. I did it my way. That's what they're doing. And then the text tells us that God comes in the cool of the day, and he's walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And that's really interesting because the word that's translated as walking there is what's called a reflexive usage of the verb. So it means walking back and forth in no particular direction and wandering back and forth. And it's the walking like this. It's the language that's used of relationships. So you go out for a walk with your... Let's go for a walk. And where should we go? Oh, no particular direction. Let's just wander. Let's just walk together and enjoy one another's company. And that's what God used to do prior to the fall. He would walk and enjoy the company of his image bearers, and they would enjoy him. And he's walking there in the cool of the day, but Adam and Eve are hiding now. So the relationship's broken. Why? Because they have cut themselves off from God. They've said, we don't need you. We're going to do it our way from now on. And you cut yourself off from the God who's the giver of life. There are consequences for that. There will be a result for that in one's life. And so we have it. And the Lord begins to speak. He speaks first to the serpent, next to the woman, and next to the man. And I want to just cover this ground briefly. First of all, something that he says to the serpent in verse 11. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So many scholars say that what we have here is the first gospel message, the first message of good news. And it's interesting that it comes in a declaration of enmity. So here's God saying to the serpent, who was the devil's instrument of the temptation, saying to the serpent, I'm going to sovereignly put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and hers. So I will introduce enmity, hatred, strife, struggle. And you might think, well, where's the good news in that? Well, actually it is good news, because what Eve had just done, and her husband, in connection with the temptation and the fall, is Adam and Eve had moved away from friendship with God, and they'd become friends with the serpent. I mean, they trusted the serpent more than they trusted God. So now they were in league with the serpent, right? That's where they were. And they were hiding from God. They were distant from God. They weren't friends with God anymore. And they'd begun the death process. So here is God saying, in this friendship situation that you have established between you and the serpent, I'm going to separate you. And I'm going to put enmity in this relationship. And this is going to go down through the generations. Your seed and hers. And that business about her seed, that's a really interesting expression too, because, you know, the ancient Hebrews weren't idiots. They knew that it was the man who carried the seed. Biologically, right? It's the man who carries the seed. So this is a very enigmatic, it's a very strange, weird expression. Seed of the woman, seed of the woman. What is that? The woman doesn't have seed. But God is saying, you know, there is this one who is coming now. He will come, and he'll be called the seed of the woman. And what he will do is crush the serpent's head. In other words, he will overturn the effects of the fall. He will undo what's happening now. He will make things right. So that's his message to the serpent. So there is judgment, hardship, difficulty, pain and strife, but these great big glimmers of hope. To the woman, ladies. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. In pain, you will give birth to children. Well, actually, that's the NIV rendition, but it's not that accurate. What God says, actually, is this. I will greatly increase your pains and your childbearing. King James Version has it right. It's definitely and. And God has just said to the serpent, salvation, the overturning of the effects of the fall, the removal of all of the curse and the pain and the suffering, has got something to do with the seed of the woman. It's got something to do with the bearing of a child. Something. And now he turns around to the woman and says, I'm going to give you lots of children. It'll be a lot easier for you to have children now. You will bear children, but there will be pain. It's going to be a painful process. Sorry, ladies, but it will. It is. It's hard work. It's labour pains. But God's got something good in mind throughout human history with all of this. I'll greatly increase your pains and your childbearing. In pain you will give birth to children. Now to Adam. So we've dealt with the serpent. We've dealt with Eve. Now to Adam. You could. You should have protected your wife. You should have not allowed this situation to occur, but you let it happen. So what about you, Adam? Well, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So you see the contrast. Genesis 1 and 2. Beautiful garden. All of these fruits. All you have to do is go and partake. All of this blessing. Now, cursed is the ground. And the ground is the basic building blocks of everything, not just of humanity, but everything. It's the dust of the earth. That expression in the Hebrew means the basic building blocks of everything. It's now under a curse. And that means that when you go and try to produce food for your wife and family now, you're going to find this hard work. And there's going to be a lot of toil, a lot of struggle, a lot of strife, a lot of disappointments, lots of thorns, lots of thistles. You will eat bread, though. You will. There's a glimmer of hope. You will get through this, but it's going to be hard. Yeah. And you will feel it. And at the end, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So, you see what's happened, folks. Adam and Eve, our first parents, we will do it our way. We don't need you, God. We can be gods ourselves. We can determine what's right and wrong. We turn our backs on the God who's the giver of all these good gifts in life. As a result, there is this curse that's on all the ground. It's inescapable. Wherever we go, we're going to meet it. Hard labour, hard yakka, pain, struggle, suffering, difficulty, setbacks, disappointments. But there is hope in this, because God's going to do something through all of this. There will be better times ahead. There will actually be the one who is coming, the seed of the woman, and he's going to overturn it all. And he's going to make things right. So that's Genesis chapter 3. The source of the pain and the suffering. Now, we're going to take another look at the problem of pain. So we began this lecture by saying there is this argument that says, if God were all good, he would want to give his creatures good things, the good life. And if he had all power, he would do that. We don't experience the good life: pain, suffering, difficulty, setbacks, hardship. Which means that God is not all good, or he doesn't have all power, or he's not there at all. So we're going to revisit this philosophical problem and take a look at a stunning verse. I was actually sort of constructing a list of verses that you might like to memorize, sort of key verses that sort of sum up where we're going. And the one was that key verse from Jeremiah. Here's another one, Isaiah 45:7. Let's turn to this. So the context here is God, through the prophet, speaking about a prophecy to Cyrus. This is well before Cyrus existed. Cyrus was the Persian ruler, one of the Persian rulers. And those guys, the Medo-Persians, they took over from the Babylonians. So we mentioned a little bit earlier that Jeremiah lived through the Babylonian captivity, and the Babylons were the big boys in the ancient world at that time, and they went around crushing all opposition. So they were imperialists, they had their empire. But then Babylon fell, and the next guys on the rise were the Medo-Persians. And they sort of took over from Babylon, and they had their empire too, prior to that of the Greeks, and then later on through history the Romans. So here is this prophecy to Cyrus, the Persian ruler. Chapter 45, verse 1. This is what the Lord says to his anointed. to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armour. That's amazing. Because this guy is not a believer. He's not part of the children of Abraham. He is a big Persian international empire guy who's going around crushing smaller nations. Bang, bang, you get in my way, bang. And I'm going to take you over, just like the Babylonians had done before these guys. And here is God saying, Cyrus is my anointed. And I'm taking hold of his right hand and I'm using him to subdue nations and to strip kings of their armour. And then he says, I'm going to go before you and I'm going to level the mountains and I'm going to do great things and so on and so forth. And then we get to verse 5. I am the Lord, there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, men may know there is none other besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. And then comes the punchline. Let me read it from the good old King James. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Doesn't that blow your mind? We started this lecture about the problem of pain. Where is God in relation to the pain of the world? This verse says he's right in the middle of it. I form the light and I create darkness. So these words are an echo of Genesis chapter 1. Right? Let there be light. And there was light. By the way, Genesis chapter 1 does not say that God created darkness. It says that he separated the light from the darkness. But the creation of darkness is implied, not stated explicitly. And God says that the light is very good. And through on in Scripture, God associates himself a lot with light, because he's the light of the world. He brings life and truth. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. John chapter 1, same thing. So God creates the light. I form the light. That's good. And then I create darkness. And the word for create here is the word bara in the Hebrew. And this is a word that's only ever ascribed to God. There are other words for create in Hebrew that are applied to human beings as well as God. My wife is very creative. She's a quilt making person. And she's done some stunning quilts. And I look at that and I say, whoa, you know. I don't have a creative bone in my body. She makes these stunning quilts. And Hebrew has a word for that. Use the word yatsara, or a word like that, fashion, to form, to make, be creative. And that word is used of God and of human beings. But the word bara, it's only ever used of God to create the world. Bereshith bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Only God gets to bara things, because he creates from nothing. We just get to shape and mould what he's already done. So here's God saying, I form the light and I bara the darkness. I make peace and create evil. And one of the things about Hebrew poetry is that it's often set up like those proverbs with parallels that are comparing one thing and contrasting another. And you're seeing the relationship between these two. They go back and forth. So I form the light and I create darkness, opposites. I make peace, and the peace is associated with light. And the word peace there is the word shalom. And shalom in the Hebrew means well-being, joy, happiness, security, provision, the good life. Shalom is a mighty good situation to be in. And in this little piece, that shalom is associated with light. It's good. It's the source of all of God's blessings. But over here, God is involved in the darkness too. He creates that. And I bara evil. I create evil. And it's an adjective here, not a noun. And so we need to say evil things, evil occurrences. And of course, it's the opposite. These are opposites. So it's the opposite of shalom. So shalom, sense of well-being, the good life, life abundantly, all these blessings. Evil over here is the opposite. Hardship, pain, misery, strife, difficulty, all the rest. And this verse is saying that God is involved with all of this. And he's even going to use a man like Cyrus to do these things. So the Persians crushed their enemies. Misery, defeat, hardship, struggle, trial, difficulty, the hardships of life. I am the Lord. I'm involved in this. And I'm using it for my purposes. So, you know, one of the frequent responses to the idea of the problem of pain is to say that actually it's got nothing to do with God. I don't know if you can remember 9/11. We were actually in Christchurch when 9/11 occurred, you know, and the image, can you remember those planes flying to that Twin Tower in London, in New York? Just absolute. We were glued to the television screens for a long time, you know, just shock, horror. What is going on? And then the week afterwards, everybody was sort of asked to, you know, reflect on this, and churches were asked to reflect on this. Christian ministers were asked to give some input. And I heard a number of them say, you know what? This had nothing to do with God. God was not involved in this at all. And I can remember thinking, you know, is that a good enough response to this? Because to say that God is not involved in it means that he's caught on by surprise, and it's just bad things happen. But Isaiah 45:7 is saying something very different. It's saying that God is involved in the good things that happen, and God is equally involved in the 9/11 thing. And somehow and in some way, he's going to use both of these for his good purposes. And this, folks, is a way for us to begin to deal with the issue of the pain and the struggle in our lives. And as we draw this to a conclusion, I want to turn to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Hopefully you've got this now. The context here is Joseph and his brothers. So you know the story. Joseph, that dreamer of dreams. 17-year-old boy, young man really. And the Lord gave him these dreams which showed that, pretty no uncertain terms, because it was confirmed that he was actually going to rise to a position of prominence, and his family would bow down to him, and even his parents. And so being a bold, brash young man, he says, "Oh, look at what God is showing, I'm going to be..." And his brothers were... And even his father was annoyed at this too. So the solution to this, as far as the brothers were concerned, is, you know what, this guy, he thinks he's... let's just get rid of him. And Judah says, well, guys, we don't need to kill him. We can actually earn a bit of profit. These traders are coming through, they're going to Egypt. We can actually sell him. Let's sell our brother. And we'll get rid of him. And there's no way we're ever going to be bowing down to him. So they sell him. And Joseph goes as a slave to Egypt. And faithfulness in a household means that he gets turfed into an Egyptian prison. And for years. Broken relationships. Family smashed. Betrayal. Hatred. The works. And Joseph is in prison. Then he comes out of prison, and Pharaoh puts him in a pretty important position, and he has his first child. And his first child he calls Manasseh. You ought to look at that passage, because when Manasseh is born, you know what Joseph says? He says, you know, I'm going to name my firstborn son a name that means forgetfulness, because I've forgotten all the pain, and I've forgotten my father's household. Firstborn son, cause for joy. Joseph's got a much better life now. But can you hear the grief in his statement? I'm going to name my son a name which means I have forgotten my father's household. I'm over it. I've moved on. Now, actually, Joseph had not moved on. And as the story unfolds, there is that glorious reconciliation with his brothers. And Joseph is in tears, and the brothers are in tears, and it's just an amazing scene. And then the father dies, and the brothers say, "Uh-oh, what if he was just treating us kindly while Dad was still around? Now that Dad's gone, maybe he can exert vengeance on us." And so Joseph has to encourage his brethren. Chapter 50, verse 19, look at what he says. Joseph says to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the savings of many people alive. So don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your children." And he reassures them and speaks kindly to them. Actually, again, I like the King James, because what he says is this: "Guys, what you did to me, you intended evil." That's the word that he uses. Evil. You intended evil for me. But God intended that very event, that very evil, for another purpose entirely. And that purpose was the saving of many, many people alive. It was a saving purpose. So you see what he's saying? He's not minimising the struggle, the pain. "Oh, don't worry, boys, I know you didn't mean..." No. You meant evil against me. But I have come to see that God's purpose in that evil and pain was a saving one, to preserve many people alive. So I'm trusting in God. So you see how Joseph has come to terms with this. It's the reality of Isaiah 45:7. I create the light and I create the evil as well. I'm involved in both these things. I'm involved in 9/11. Don't think I'm absent from it. I'm right there in the midst of it. And I'm going to use it for my purposes, which are ultimately good purposes for the world. Do you trust me? And Joseph, by the time of the end of the book of Genesis, he is trusting God and he's overcome his pain, and now there's the reconciliation. But that's a little glimpse into the way we need to function as well, because we're in the midst of pain. We know the reason for it. We know why it's here in the world. We need to know that God cares. He certainly does. We need to know that God is not distant from these trials. He's right there in the midst of them. And we need to know that God is going to use even my sins that I commit, the mistakes that I make and the mess that I make of life. God is able to use even that for his good purposes. And this gives us that hope, that confidence that we need, that again is based not a hope against hope, but I trust you, Lord. I trust you. Please bring about what you choose to do in these circumstances.